Welcome to Learning DSLR Back to Basics. This is episode 2 of my new video tutorial series that covers off some fundamentals of DSLR photography in an animated presentation. This episode I'm going to talk about aperture and stops of light. First of all, let's talk about our camera and lens, and let's look at a sample lens like the Canon 50mm f1.4. Unlike the previous episode where we were talking about focal length and 50mm was the value that was of interest, we're now talking about the aperture value, which typically starts with an f1.4. So if you look on the barrel of your lens, you might also see this stated as a ratio 1 to 1.4. And your lens will have different apertures, but this is the portion of the lens we're talking about, and we're going to just define it and get a solid understanding of what it is and its values and how they work relative to the other settings in your camera. Now, aperture is the opening through which light travels into the camera, and what that does is it controls the intensity of light, so the amount of light kind of coming in all at once. If this was equivalent to what kind of a water metaphor, it would be the size of the pipe, how much can come in all at one time. And when you look at the aperture value and you see that strange numbering and lettering, f1.4, you have to wonder, well, what is this and why is it stated that way? And how can I begin to understand the relationship between it and the other aperture values available to me? The first thing you need to know is that the aperture value stated on your lens is actually talking about what is the maximum opening size on the lens, and not just what is its size in millimeters, but what is it as a ratio relative to focal length. And if you want to know more about focal length, again, I suggest you watch episode 1 of DSLR Back to Basics. But let's go and talk about this 50mm lens example. So we've got a 50mm focal length, and let's just say that red circle, the red diameter there, is exactly 50mm. Then the ratio is going to be 1 to 1. You've got 50 to 50. So if you reduce it, you've got 1 to 1. Oh yes, and what in the photography world, what they do is they also remove the numerator, because it's always going to be 1, and replace it with f. So it really is still just a fraction. It's just that they're replacing f for focal length in the numerator. So let's look at a couple actual aperture sizes, and I think this will solidify the understanding here. So here are some actual sizes that you might see in a 50mm lens. If you don't state those as a ratio, 50 to 25mm and so on, and simply do the reduction, meaning divide 50 from each side, then you're going to be left with the values that you might be familiar with as aperture values. So take that middle example. If you divide 17.9 by 50, you're left with 2.8. If you now drop the numerator 1 slash and replace it with f slash, you're going to get f 2.8. So what really kind of screws up amateurs and people new to DSLR photography is that as the aperture opening increases, the aperture values are actually decreasing. So if you want to let in more light and have a bigger opening, you need a smaller f value. And again, that's a function of the fact that it's a ratio. Now let's talk about a light stop. A light stop is a factor of 2 change in light intensity. So let's just talk about a simple example, such as having a light bulb in front of your camera. If you wanted to double the light, you would have 2 light bulbs. But it also works in the other direction. So when we double it, we say that we've got 1 stop more of light, but we can also say that we have 1 stop less. So it's not just doubling, it's a factor of 2 change. So let's just say you're photographing a room that's got a certain amount of ambient light, so you can't turn on more lights, you can't change the lights. So you have to change the settings in the actual camera. If you were only going to modify your shutter speed and wanted to add a stop of light, I wanted to double the intensity of light, maybe to overcome some underexposure. What do I need to do? I need to double my shutter speed. So if I had a shutter speed of 1 second, I would have to double it to 2 seconds. But just remember, in fractions, if it was the 60th of a second, a doubling of that, meaning twice as long, the shutter speed being open, it would be a 30th of a second. ISO, which is the sensitivity of your camera to light, If you want to make it twice as sensitive, the way the numbering scheme works is that it's just a doubling of the number itself. So if you had an ISO of 400 and wanted to make it twice as sensitive to the same light, you would change it to ISO 800. Now, as it relates to aperture, we're not talking about, we are talking about the size of the opening, but we're talking about the area, and a doubling of that area is going to let in twice as much light. So this kind of messes up, because it's a ratio relative to focal length and all these things, it's not an exact doubling or halving of the number. So if you have your camera set to f8 and you thought, well, I want to double the amount of light let into my camera, remember the inverse relationship. So I want to make the aperture bigger, I need a smaller number. So you're thinking, aha, I've got it. It's going to be f4. You'd be wrong. Unfortunately, it's 5.6. And it's because, again, you're talking about the area of the aperture, not the actual just diameter. And I'll get into this more. So the question comes up then is, well, what are the main aperture values, and which aperture values relative to one another represent a doubling of light? Here's a trick for remembering all the aperture values that you can come across on your lenses. Start with the value of f1, of theoretical very open aperture. Then double it to f2, and then keep doubling it, f4, f8, f16, f32. The way the math works is that the doubling of the number actually is 4 times as much light. So we need to find the interim values here. And it turns out that based on the math and calculating area, what we need as a multiplier is not 2, but the root of 2, the square root of 2. So that's 1.4. So if you multiply 1.4 across all of these values, f 1.4 on 1, 1.4 times 2 is 2.8, and so on and so forth, and you round the values, you'd end up with all of the interim values. And when you put them in line, this represents one-stop increments. So each jump from one of these values to the next is a factor of 2 change in light. So if we look at the, f5.6 to f4, you're going to double the amount of light let into your camera because you're going to make the aperture opening larger by actually doubling the area of that opening. And if someone ever says to you, well, you need to stop down, or I've stopped down on my lens, and they're talking about aperture, then again, they're just talking about taking a stop of light out of the equation. And so they've moved probably from a sample aperture value of f11 to f16 by making the hole half as small. And since your camera is trying to give you, various controls for getting the right exposure, doubling light is quite a big step. So they offer you 1/3 increments. They do this in aperture values, but they also do it in shutter speed and ISO. And you'll notice that if you pull out your camera, every click, when say you're in aperture priority mode, every click of that wheel is actually a 1/3 stop. So if you were on f4, working your way up to 5.6, you would go click 4.5, click 5, and then click one more time to f5.6. And so without even looking at your camera, 3 clicks is 1 stop. So if you did 3 clicks on aperture, and then say you're on manual, and you could also change your shutter speed, 3 clicks in the other direction on shutter speed would be a factor of 2 change on that as well, and you'd effectively stay balanced. So you'll notice on your lenses that you're not going to have all of the aperture range that I'm talking about here. You're not going to be able to get to f1. Consumer lenses, especially the kit lenses that come with your cameras, are going to have a fairly limited range, and they're going to be as open, as big an aperture as f3.5 or f4, and as small an aperture as probably f22. But what's more important is the large aperture, because by having that be limited, you've more or less got a ceiling. So if you're indoors and you're trying to do a shot handheld, and now you're at f4 and you need to let in more light, but your camera can't let in more light, you're going to resort to having to have a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO setting. And we'll talk about this in the next episode. But it means that you've got less control, less creative control, and you may not actually be able to get the shot that you're trying to get. Pro-grade lenses, on the other hand, tend to have much larger apertures, and It's part of the reason why they cost more. The glass is actually made better, but by having a larger aperture, it means that they need actually physically larger pieces of glass. That in itself is harder to make, and there's a few other things that contribute to that. But you might find pro-grade lenses tend to have a maximum aperture of around f2.8 or better. But there is another category of lenses. These are the prime lenses that I talk about often, and they're the ones that don't zoom. And because they don't zoom, they're simpler to make, they have less pieces of glass, they can let in a lot of light without any kind of obstruction, so their maximum aperture is actually quite good. And you don't have to buy pro-grade prime lenses. You can buy consumer-grade prime lenses, so to speak, that are only a few $100s. You can get, for example, a 50 millimeter f1.8 for only $100. So you might find prime lenses tend to be in the range of f1.2, 1.4 all the way down. So these are a great option. So why not state aperture values as a size, for example, in millimeters instead of a ratio? And the answer for that is that to get the same amount of light intensity into the camera, you have to factor in the focal length. As you can see in the diagram here, if you had a very large zoom lens, you actually need a physically bigger opening to let in as much light as a 24 millimeter lens with a smaller opening. So focal length, the zoom level, actually impacts light intensity. And so what you really need to do is just trust that the lens manufacturers have got this right for you. They've calibrated these so that all the lenses are the same, and you've got a consistency across all manufacturers and all lens focal lengths, so that if everything else were to stay the same, you're guaranteed the same exposure. I could set my shutter speed and ISO to something fixed, put on a 24 millimeter lens at f2.8, shoot a picture. Now take it off, put on a 300 millimeter lens at f2.8, and I'm going to get a perfect exposure. And so despite the fact that the f numbers are a bit screwy and their inverse relationship to the opening size is a little counterintuitive, the camera manufacturers are actually doing you a favor by doing a lot of calibration ahead of time and making it consistent across all the lenses. So you'll take a look at your lens and you notice that the aperture value is actually stated as a range. A very popular Canon kit lens is the 18 to 55 millimeter lens, and it's an f3.5 to 5.6. So what does that mean? It just means that the way they've constructed the lens, the relationship between the zoom level, the focal length of 18 millimeters, and the maximum diameter works out to 3.5. But as you zoom in, the maximum diameter is not changing in proportion to the zoom level. And so if you did the math again, you don't get 3.5, you get 5.6. And if I've done my math correctly, that means you've got about 58% less light. So as you zoom in, your camera has to compensate in other ways because you're missing more than half the light you had to start with. So now your shutter speed has to more than double, for example. So this is not ideal, but what it does is it allows them to construct a lens that's very affordable to build, and it's the difference between a $150 kit lens and a $1,500 pro lens. And a pro lens, let's take an example. A very popular one is the Canon 24 to 70 f2.8 L. I didn't put the L there, but it means pro grade lens. And again, there's more to a pro grade lens than this, but one of the important aspects of pro grade zoom lenses is that they offer a constant aperture. So as they zoom from 24 to 70, it stays f2.8 throughout the entire zoom range. That's a lot tougher to build and calibrate. And that gives them the benefit of having consistency in their settings. If you're a pro photographer and you're in manual mode and you've set your shutter and your ISO and your lights are set up a certain way, you don't want to have to zoom to change your composition rather, and suddenly have to change some settings and increase your light intensity or change your shutter speeds. And if you're shooting video, you might lock down a number of things on video, and then you might want to zoom in and start the video, but you don't want to have to recalibrate and set all your settings again just to get the right exposure. So having a constant aperture is a great benefit. So that's it. I've covered off aperture and stops of light. I hope you found that useful. In the next episode, we're going to talk about exposure, which is effectively the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Please head over to my blog over at learningdslr.com, or meet me on the social web at facebook.com/learningdslr, or tweet me anytime at learningdslr. Thank you.